Ready to go?
Rolling.
Okay. Larry, I want to go through a long list of names and ask if you can very quickly tell the people who will see this who these people were.
Very good.
Because we went over them very quickly earlier. John Salter.
John Salter was a teacher at Tougaloo College who was very political. He was involved in demonstrations in Jackson that were NAACP led. He worked very closely with Medgar Evers, and he worked very closely with Ed King.
And Medgar Evers.
Medgar Evers was the executive director of the NAACP. He was a person who went disguised to get information about the Emmett Till case. He was the political leader of the NAACP in Mississippi. He was very involved in in a lot of the political activity and civil rights involvement in the state.
And Tom Gaither.
Tom Gaither was a core member early in Mississippi and continues to be involved in the civil rights movement to this day.
Now, you mentioned when you were talking about the Freedom House address earlier that it was a place of reconciliation. What did you mean by that?
What I meant was that it was a place for people, regardless of where you stood in the movement, you were welcome there. Braden comes into the meeting, and he, as you know, Braden was a leftist.
Yeah.
And
Carl Braden.
Carl Braden.
Yeah.
He has money, so he buys food, and because we didn't at that particular time we didn't have any money. Okay? I mean, so it was this kind of place. That's why I termed it that way.
Okay, John Doerr. We mentioned him a bit. Tell us a little bit more about John Doerr.
John Doerr is a hero of the civil rights movement, and he is best characterized as a man who was a relentless worker, who didn't stick to the script, who was responsible for moving the Department of Justice into civil rights vigorously.
He's an assistant attorney general.
He was the assistant attorney general to Robert Kennedy, who was the United States attorney. It was the U.S. attorney general. John Doerr was a Republican, very perceptive, very creative. I watched John Doerr represent the government in the case of Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman. And he said, he quoted Lincoln. He said, people will little note here what we say, but they will long note what we do. Mm-hmm. And of course, those people were convicted. So John Doerr, and I'm going to quote him, in 1967, he was at a conference at Ole Miss, and he was talking about the press and the civil rights movement. He said, look, the Voting Rights Act was passed in two cities, Macomb and the streets of Greenwood. Because what we were able to do is convince John Doerr and others that illiterates had the right to vote. And we convinced them, and we got that written into the Voting Rights Act. And Katzenbach, who was then testifying before the Judiciary Committee, said, I'm convinced of the constitutionality of all of this except the right of illiterates to vote. And we had argued, and we got the Congress to go along with us. And that's how no other group fought for the right of illiterates to vote except SNCC.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Gerald Ford.
Gerald Ford was a congressman from Michigan, and then later president of the United States. And when I talked to him, he was a member of the Congress. And he agreed to talk with us, and he told us because his bishop had asked him to. And when we talked to him, we talked about the congressional challenge, what was the basis of it, and he told us that he was going to do what the law requires.
And the Wednesday group, you mentioned a little bit about it, but tell us a little more about what the Wednesday group was.
Of course. The Wednesday group was organized by Dorothy Height. The Wednesday group were people brought in from across the country, from various states at various times, to come in and listen to the activists in Mississippi, find out what's going on, find out what they can do. Then they would leave and go back to their hometowns and talk to their senators, their congressmen, their bankers, their civic clubs, to put pressure on the Department of Justice to protect the voting rights activists.
Now, you also mentioned a couple of times the Ladner sisters, but flesh them out a little more.
Joyce and Dory Ladner come out of Hattiesburg, Mississippi. They are related to Vernon Damer, who is a real civil rights hero. They are related to Medgar Evers. They're related to Victoria Gray, who is the national committee woman of the Freedom Democratic Party, who is also very active in SCLC. Victoria Gray goes to SCLC and gives a great speech, and Abernathy says, "Okay, Victoria, what do you want?" She said, "I want $7,000 for the Freedom Democratic Party," and they write the check. I mean, Victoria Gray was another religious fanatic. See, we had one in Fannie Lou Hamer, we had another in Victoria Gray, who becomes a political activist, who brings in her family. There were more people in the freedom schools in Hattiesburg than anywhere else in the country, in the state. The case of Theron Lynn is tried by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in Hattiesburg.
He's the registrar in Forest County.
He's the registrar in Forest County. He takes the position that he's not. You have Julian. He turned down postgraduate degree people because they said you just didn't complete the test right. There's a great book written about him. It's called Count Them One by One, and it's written by one of the attorneys who operated in that state. It's a great. Why is it a great book? Because it talks about the trying of Theron Lynn for contempt. It talks about the courage of the witnesses who participated in that, and it establishes a basis, as does the author say, and I totally agree, for really passing the Voting Rights Act, because it was very clear that the recalcitrance of this registrar, which was also analogous to 82 other registrars like him, because there's one in each county, once the court ruled against him, he simply refused to register people. Now, and this is the federal court. Now, John Doerr, when they're trying Theron Lynn, introduces me to Judge Brown, Tuttle, and Bell. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals followed, and there's a great book about this called Unsung Heroes by Jack Bass. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals follows and joins the Department of Justice in making sure that whatever they can do to back up the movement in Mississippi, they do it. We knew if we lost in Meridian or Jackson, all we had to do was wait until we get to New Orleans. Because in New Orleans, we win.
Griffin Bell voted.
One moment.
Okay.
We have somebody at the door, right?
All right.
They went away?
Oh, yeah. They went circuit, and how helpful it was back in those days.
These were all, the Fifth Circuit was made up of the most creative group of people who were committed to making the law useful for social political change. Ironically, these were all Eisenhower appointees. Each one of them filed challenged delegations in their states, Louisiana, Georgia, and Texas. And they won those positions, which helped Eisenhower get the presidency. Eisenhower said to them, "What do y'all want?" They wanted to get on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. They were on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And they established a legend of expanding the constitutional rights of everyone that came before them. Their position on the city of Jackson was that Jackson had an apartheid policy that was incomparable of anywhere else in the United States. That was the official position of the Fifth Circuit. They validated the removal cases filed by Arthur Kenoy, and they were later overturned by the Supreme Court and narrowed. They validated all Section 5 cases. John Doerr simply had to get to New Orleans, bring the case, and it was won. They overturned decision after decision by Judge Cox, who was an atrocious racist, who talked about black people registering to vote as a bunch of chimpanzees. But once we got to the Fifth Circuit, he was overturned.
One of them you mentioned, however, Griffin Bell, voted against me and kept me out of the Georgia legislature for almost 6 months.
Oh, Griffin Bell did some things worse than that.
Yeah.
Griffin Bell said to Andy Young, "Don't testify against Bork." And of course, as you know, Andy Young, to his credit, testified against Bork. No, I want to make it clear that of the judges on the Fifth Circuit, Bell was the least praiseworthy. But the Fifth Circuit was of the highest caliber of productivity for empowerment and for the revitalization of the 15th Amendment. It was amazing. These people treated what we were doing as their work. Theron Lynn, the only reason the Fifth Circuit didn't send Theron Lynn to jail was because they were again concerned about the political impact. He was 7'4", and he weighed 400 pounds. They didn't want him to die in jail. But they tried him for contempt, and they got what they wanted out of him. But again, once it became clear that you were faced with Theron Lynn type recalcitrance throughout the state of Mississippi, then you had to come up with a new mechanism. And a la comes the Voting Rights Act. And it was written by the Department of Justice.
Let me mention another name you mentioned that needs some explanation of who he is, Michael Thelwell. Michael
Thelwell is a brilliant man who comes out of NAG at the students.
NAG is a Nonviolent Action Group.
Out of Howard University.
Right.
He becomes involved with SNCC, and he becomes attacked. And I asked him, we raised some money, and I said, Michael, here's the check. Go to Washington, set up an office for the MFDP. Well, he sets up what he does. He comes to Washington. He works with a couple of people, and he is able to follow the legislation in the Congress. He's able to deal with the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, and he's able to keep us informed on what he's doing. He writes a letter to Lyndon Johnson saying, we're astounded. All of the work that the Freedom Democratic Party did to get you elected in Mississippi, and none of our people have been invited to the inaugural. And Fannie Lou Hamer calls him and said, Mike, you know the man who's the postman? He said, no, Miss Howard. He said, well, he brings me this big envelope from the White House. And I'm invited, and then Mr. Turnbow calls, and he said, Michael, I want to let you know I got an invitation to the White House, and I want you to do something for me, Michael. Michael said, well, what do you want me to do, Mr. Turnbow? He said, I want you to find out what ball the governor of Mississippi is going to, because I want to dance with his wife. Hartman Turnbow, as you know, is a man who's accused of destroying his house, setting his house on fire. He has his wife and his daughters in this house, and he comes out shooting, and he kills a white man. But the state of Mississippi said, wait a minute now. We can't have a situation where we're charging someone who's defending his wife and his daughter from a burning house that's his. So what they decided, Julian, was that this man died of a heart attack. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you, I know you may find this hard to believe. John Doerr and others asked me, would I be willing to go to the sheriff of Lafleur County, get him to sign a reciprocity bond to take to the sheriff of Holmes County and have Mr. Turnbow released to me. Now, Holmes County, 80% of the black people in Holmes County own their land. Hmm. What was so strange about this was the Department of Justice understood that the only way to handle this was to go along with the state of Mississippi in the position that there was no murder. There was just a house burning. And then, of course, because the Department of Justice rigorously defends Mr. Turnbow, all charges are dropped on that. I did this myself. So I'll tell you what. There is no other recorded event where two sheriffs in the South combined to release by bond that they signed civil rights workers anywhere in the South. It never happened again.
One final name, you mentioned a couple of times, Robert Moses.
Robert Moses is a young man who came to Mississippi, a mathematician and a philosopher, who was able to get the most out of people regardless of what they thought of themselves. Robert Moses was a person who was totally committed to social change, who was able to work with anyone. He was able to be both an intellectual and a total humanist. He was a man who who believed that there was political potential in everyone, and who behaved that way, and who got a lot of people associated with him to behave that way. He was a totally courageous person, totally committed, and a thinker that has few people on his level. He was able to take problems and turn them into solutions. He was able to meld the difference between the rigidity of some of the SNCC folks with the free expression of total liberty to others. He firmly believed that he was ahead of the game on one other tenet. He firmly believed that those who do the work should make the decisions. He firmly believed that whenever anyone was arrested in SNCC, you either go to get them out of jail or you go to jail with them. And he never, I mean, here's a man who was beaten in Macomb, and he files charges against the person who beat him. And the sheriff hurriedly held the trial, and we know how the trial went, Julie. And then they got him out of town. It's just unheard of. You mean you expect to be treated legally by a legal system that is designed not to treat people like you? He goes before a judge in Macomb, and the judge brags about how good we treat our darkies. And Moses writes, racists are never more exposed than when they brag. I mean, here's a man who is able to lay out the framework of what's going to happen in Mississippi. And then we couldn't do anything in Mississippi without the approval of the people of Mississippi. And that we got it. And we got it because we made it clear to them that we were never going to say to them, look, you need to go register to vote. Here's where the courthouse is, going on down there. We said to them, we're going, and we want you to come with us. And we never said to them, we're going to protect you. We never said to them, your name's not going to be in the newspaper. We never said to them, you're going to become an enemy of the state once you register to vote. And the complexity and the beauty of how Mississippi was organized was we got thousands of people to make that commitment. And I think it pivoted on two things. One, our style of operation. Two, the church. And three, the need for people to create a better way of life for their children. You see, we didn't have to tell people in Mississippi everything is political, because they understood that the Board of Supervisors determined whether or not there was a hospital in the ward, whether or not there were jobs, whether or not who was going to get paved. You could look at who was registered to vote on the street with the houses that were paved. You wanted tax exemptions, so there was nothing that was non-political in Mississippi. And so we arrived at the early conclusion that the political avenue was a solution to a lot of our problems. And they were in the 60s, there was no Republican Party in the South. Nowhere to be found. It wasn't until 1964 that the Republican Party that the Democratic Party in Mississippi creates the unpledged electoral system, which allows us to become the presidential electors for Lyndon Johnson. But it also allows the infusion of the Republican Party. In 1964, the Republican Party in San Francisco kicks out black delegates, kicks them out. The Democratic Party is supporting the passage of the 64 Public Accommodations Act, and of course later on the 65 Voting Rights Act. So in 1960, you have the Democratic Party being approached to intervene in Martin Luther King's arrest. Lewis Martin and others they get the president to call Dr. King's wife, Coretta Scott King. Joe, the first black baseball player, Jackie Robinson, goes to Nixon and says, look, you can do this, you should do this. And he leaves crying because Nixon refuses to do it. Now we both know that telephone call and the blue leaflet that was passed out to every black church in America within 6 days is what made President Kennedy President Kennedy. Without the black vote.
I wish I could lay my hands on a copy of that leaflet. They call it the Blue Bomb.
I'm sure we can get it for you. And the guy who can get it for you is a guy named Hawk Davis at the University of Southern Florida. I have a copy of the trial transcript at Winona. I have a copy of every deposition taken by the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party during the convention, and I got it all from him.
Now, when all is said and done, what would you like the world to know about you and the work you did in the freedom movement?
What I'd like the world to know is that I was a man who carried out his religious beliefs by his political activity. I never stepped away from a fight. I never asked any quarter. I never gave any. And I recognized the value of reading and of books. And I want to be remembered as someone who is committed to the perpetuation of the mantra of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Because the only thing that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee can be compared with is the Anti-Saloon League. The Anti-Saloon League was very effective, though short-lived. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee changed the very concept of democracy, changed the concept of citizenship, changed the open to everyone the vehicle of empowerment, because empowerment is something that's contagious. Once people are empowered, once an individual makes something happen that they made happen, they're a different person. They don't wait for someone. The next day they say, well, what do I need to do today? That's the kind of people we need to have a good America.
Now, is there something we should have asked you that I didn't ask?
I can't think of anything except that we have an obligation to transfer our skills and our knowledge to other people. You're doing that, and I'm doing that.
But are we doing it as much as we should?
Well, no, but let us hope that we will understand the gravity of our situation. And in the next 2 years, we will spread by geometric progression those who are actively organizing. See, we don't need people to support us and agree with us and not register their families to vote, not register their churches to vote, not register their clubs to vote, and not really make organizing a social necessity. Mm-hmm. We should declare those who are not organizing for our empowerment and for political change in the next 2 years as social pariahs. They're no longer functioning on our behalf. Isn't it amazing how we've, as a race, have moved from the concept of us to me?
Yes.
And we're the last group that can afford that. Mm. So, but now, we're faced with an opposition that is so menacing to everything we value that now we must fight. Everything we've fought for will be beyond retrieving.
Well, on that happy note, let's thank you for doing this. We greatly appreciate it.
I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
It's our pleasure.
Thank you both for doing this.